Tuesdays. It's coming on right now. All right, so our YouTube channel, we are on live now on our YouTube channel and YouTube channel UCU, yes, Umoja Caribbean Union. That's our YouTube channel. For our YouTube viewers, our Facebook page that this is being broadcasted live on is Kwanzaa Every Day. All right, so and here next by me is
Ras Malachi.
how you doing, Ras Malachi?
I am grateful. I'm doing well.
Are you ready for the marathon?
We're going to do our best to get as far as we can go. We're on page 236.
Awesome. Okay.
Right, and we'll be starting off with me. And we'll start the reading.
So we'll be reading what, an hour and
A half
for hour and a half. Oh, you got it started already?
Yes.
Okay, so let's begin.
All right. So I'll be reading as me, and Shalima will be reading as she. And we got a minute before you can actually start reading. So if you have anything else to say, we have a minute. So if you have anything you want to say.
Oh, well, for the most part, for the YouTube on Facebook, get your Crucian Dialogues, and actually it's available on Amazon and also on the island of St. Croix. You can contact this number 340-277-7485. Again, 340-277-7485 to get your copy of the book. All right? And yes, definitely, this is a marathon, so we are hoping to complete this section of the book, which is she and me.
And I'm me, and Shalima will be she. So that's Shalima. All right. You've probably done a better job of describing the scenario between Paiwanski and the Centonian politician that I was able to. My effort was to highlight the aura and are the surrounding and are the surrounding persona and saw in their Messiah. In his memoir, Senate President Earl Ackley described the Paiwanski years as "oh happy days," and it would be Ackley who would translate the vision of the governor into the marching orders of his political party. The need for a new election code sprang from Paiwanski's disenchantment with the white appointed governor was a founding member of the Democratic Party with no intention of changing his political affiliation to the Unity Party. So the alliance started out with Paiwanski, the Democrat, together with the Unity Party dominating his own party base on St. Thomas.
Now I see the confusion. Taiwan and his Unity Party against the very political organization he helped to found. Of course, it would have been a simple shift if the white man had just changed his party to become a member of the Unity Party. And since it's mental slavery and consciousness we're studying, this is an opportunity to emphasize how important it was for the white man to stay in his comfort zone while insisting the black politicians make a change.
This is the motive that caused the Centonian politicians to attempt to colonize this island. As I explained earlier, the Democratic Party was dominant on St. Croix and St. John, while the Unity Party controlled the politics of St. Thomas. This being the reality, any national affiliations would require a takeover of the Democratic Party, and this was precisely what Taiwan basically told the Centurion that unless they were affiliated with a national party, they had no future. So you see, Attlee and his faction were left no choice but to plot a strategy to wrestle control of the Democratic Party from the Crucians. The Republican Party was simply not an option, but what you perceive as a power grab by colonized, mentally enslaved black people. Correct. We just had no way of knowing Paiwanski was in the mix, pulling the strings.
Consciousness is truly something amazing. Up until a few minutes ago, I disliked Doc James for that one thing. And the way I heard the story, I thought it was something that happened in the 80s. It's only now that I'm getting the full picture of how the St. Thomas Party took over ours. That's why I'm so amazed at how my feelings could change. I started to pity the man because, like so many politicians on St. Croix, if not most of them, he was probably envious of what he would have considered a success by the Centomians. Nothing in his consciousness would have prepared him for the social and economic changes unfolding before his eyes. Howsoever he might have interpreted them, it would have been obvious where the cockpit of change was. So, why shouldn't he want to be a part of it? He presented itself to him to get in on the ground floor for his island. Wouldn't he have been expected to see himself as the one in position to call the shots for St. Croix?
Good point and great analysis. Crucian politicians would have found themselves in a peculiar position, especially the two new senators as members of the St. Thomas Party. Just the year before, St. the Crucian senator who had pushed the deal had been ousted. St. Thomas was clearly making the decisions for St. Croix. What role were Crucian's representatives to play? Take a look at the already Americanized consciousness and tell me what you see. Do you think you'll find that would be contrary to what St. Thomas was doing? Unfortunately, we were the low-hanging fruit, ripe fruit. Our post-war generation was was as receptive to white America and benignly neglectful to black America as St. Thomas was. We simply didn't have the great harbor and the activities it spurred. So, as we were prepared to be second best. Hence, another step back and another dose of inferiority. We were ready to be led by the St. Thomas politicians. We just didn't know their plan was to take us over.
Low hanging ripe fruit. Another way to look at it would be a disaster waiting to happen. In 1963, we had all the components for the island's population doubled by 1970. Wouldn't this have been the height of the social friction you mentioned earlier? And don't think I've forgotten. Wasn't this when Bethlehem and sugarcane were shut down? Who would have thought? But the American 60s was almost the opposite for us. We most definitely took a step backward in circumstances and upbringing.
You said it. Do you think it is even more amazing that we could subconsciously understand something we're not conscious of?
What do you mean? How could we subconsciously understand something we don't consciously understand?
How often have you heard our people say things like monkey see, monkey do, or warning not to curse and use profanity in the presence of children. Are these acknowledgments that we understand consciousness to come from circumstances and upbringing? It might be subconscious, but we're definitely making the connection as to how information makes its way to our consciousness. What I find amazing is how flightly and frivolous we can be about it without grasping how vulnerable to external influences, as if it were only monkeys and children who would be susceptible to circumstances and upbringing.
Maybe that's why they train us, but refuse to educate us. Until today, I had no idea what consciousness was or how it functioned. What I know now to be consciousness, I always thought to be intelligence. It never occurred to me that consciousness was this summary of all our experiences, whether we saw it, touched it, smelled it, tasted it, or heard it, as long as we experienced it, that it's deposited in consciousness. I think that's where it could get confusing because I, for one, really thought you knew things because of your intelligence. So I imagine a lot of people would experiences, they would be just as informed and appear just as intelligent. How were we to know that if you control our circumstances and upbringing, you control our consciousness?
My point is that we've known it subconsciously. We just couldn't make the connection in our conscious mind. How could we warn each other of something as obvious using profanities in the presence of children because they might pick it up? Yet not understand where the information in our head comes from. Are we?
Are you implying we had to go through all our ordeals as a people so we could be exposed to the circumstances and upbringing that would provide our consciousness with the information necessary to overcome our situation?
Is it like that? But we're pretty much saying the same thing. Just like Mr. Jackson couldn't conceive of mental slavery, or Doc James couldn't perceive he was being used, it still boils down to the reality that we can't retrieve information from our consciousness that was never there.
And that's the reality we can't escape, whether by circumstance or upbringing. If our consciousness has been exposed to the information, we simply can't access it, retrieve it. Yet in 1963, Doc James and Patrick Williams will go along with the shutting down of our agricultural industry as the right thing to do. Am I wrong? Didn't they go along with Pywanski's plan to sell the Bethlehem factory and stop planting sugarcane?
Yes, they did. But that decision wasn't announced until 1964, when they were already committed. The Great White Father may have been more aware of our mentality than we were. After all, in 1963, that he brought New York University to the Virgin Islands to conduct a comprehensive study of our public education system. The study was completed and recommendations were made to our government in a matter of weeks. Needless to say, we wholeheartedly accepted the recommendation and even tasked NYU with the job of implementing the recommendations.
And was that how we got a new and wanting as I find it? I always thought it to be a jerry built system with an unsuited architect. And lo and behold, if that's not what you're telling me, what did New York University know about the Virgin Islands that they could study our situation and recommend what we needed, all in a matter of weeks.
As I recall, NYU condensingly described us for expecting or derided us for expecting better results from a system with an 80 to 1 student to teacher ratio and unqualified teachers in the classroom.
Wow, was that the number of students a teacher had to deal with? No wonder they went off on us like that. That's an impossible ratio for the best.
It doesn't surprise me to hear you react like that. We just agreed a person is literally a prisoner of the information in his consciousness. How can I expect you to know information that was never available to your consciousness or upbringing? Hadn't the St. Thomians and Crucian politician went along with NYU's study and recommendation?
They were condemning. Talk about mental slavery. What better example of it could anybody want? What a classic case of self incrimination. Not illiterate grassroots people, not even middle class professionals, but lawmakers, Virgin Islands senators, officially, even if indirectly, certifying they were not properly educated. For us,
For us for truth. To this day, there has never been any determination as to the effectiveness of that system, lacking in resources as it was.
so what do you mean? Did they determine that the students weren't learning? It would be just like them to accept the word of the big time white university and embrace their recommendations.
What we got was a school system had and still has no relation whatsoever to a black population in the Caribbean. Virtually all our teachers became disqualified to teach overnight. The new system required a college degree. The very same year, the College of the Virgin Islands opened as a junior college. Of course, the result was a major influx of teachers from the state. They weren't all white, but the majority were, with names of such foreign pronunciation, they intimidated students. It has never been a good fit. Most African American teachers made adjustments and adapted soon enough. The same couldn't be said of the white imported teachers. They maintained a high turnover rate, but the politician teacher ratio of 35 to 1 after implementation of the new system. So our establishment hailed the work of New York University and pronounced the administration's initiatives a success.
Lord Harry the Judge, it's only by the grace of God that we haven't been declared a failed state yet. How long is it going to take us to realize this school system of ours isn't working a century ago?
Think about it. Every one of those African descendant politicians went to school right here in these schools and with those teachers NYU criticized. Yet today, almost 50 years later, there is no dispute the school system produced better results before it was changed. But we refuse to even attempt to educate the educators we need. As with nurses, we rather pay more to import than to educate. There's something else at work here. This can't be just stupidity.
It's as if Paiwanski brought in his experts to certify that blacks weren't ready for prime time, and our politicians just bowed their heads, kicked the ground, and agreed with a smile. You can argue with my language, but not the thoughts. How could any reasonable person dismiss the schools that stupidity to not see you were condemning yourself? This is plain and simply mental slavery, isn't it? Of course, it is classic. You just want to hear me highlight it. Well, what I see is that the schools and the education system were our sources of formal upbringing, and it seems to me that it had appeared like a curse that had descended on us. Those homegrown teachers had mastered the fundamentals and passed them on to their students with the only consciousness they had, the love of nurturing their own children. Apparently, the ratio could have been 100 to 1, and those teachers would have still been effective. Whatever their method might have been, it worked, and it was homegrown. Some very robust intellects got their stem with my son, and I can recall even some ambassador who came out of those St. Thomas schools.
You're talking about Ambassador Terence Stadman.
Yes, that's the man. Could you imagine? They actually condemned the man's schooling. No, not stupidity, but mental slavery. Pywanski needed to ensure that any and all offered in the territory was of the American kind. With hindsight, we can see how effective his policies have been. The stuff you've explained about the man has had a lasting impact on our lives as Crucians. Doesn't that also speak to how we've been dominated by St. Thomas power brokers? Back then, he was laying the foundation for a Willie Lynch scenario that would keep us at each other's throat while we continue to pay tribute to the next proposed side anywhere but here. I had certainly forgotten about schooling, that formal upbringing. But as you pointed out, Pywanski didn't forget about it. Before he shut down agriculture and changed the landscape, he took charge of the formal upbringing we would be exposed to. And I guess that's what I needed to see, that both our circumstances and upbringing were radically changed under this man's administration.
9 days after the March on Washington that featured the oratory of Crucian Frank Crosswaite and the memorable I Have a Dream speech of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., St. Croix experienced its biggest demonstration of the era with estimates ranging from 1,500 to 3,000. You see the hope etched in your features, but it was not to be. Earlier in the year, the most segregated pride, the most segregated city in America had been targeted by the civil rights movement. That boycott in Birmingham, Alabama caused Dr. King to be arrested and incarcerated. Maybe you are not familiar with the version of that famous letter from Birmingham jail by Dr. King. That made that made children between the ages of 6 and 18 took to the streets in support of their jailed parents. They were beaten, bitten by police dogs, and knocked senseless by the power and water sprayed from the hoses of firefighters. The brutality was captured for posterity by the TV cameras.
I know what you're seeing that footage. It's the most inhumane images of white men attacking children. You're right. 1963 turned out to be a pivotal year for the struggle in the States. Thank God we were finally able to get our act together and show some support for the movement.
I wish I could agree with you, but our massive demonstration in Bass in town had nothing to do with blackness or solidarity with our brothers and sisters in the struggle. It Fritz Lawet's white politician protesting the shutdown of the sugarcane.
Wait a minute. I thought you said it was the biggest demonstration of the 60s.
That's what it was. I can give you every assurance the island never saw anything to march it during the 60s.
But the 60s was the civil rights movement, biggest social protest 9 days after the March on Washington, and it had no relation to blackness. That's obscene. I know what you said earlier about us just ignoring the movement as if it didn't happen, but there's a limit to everything. Those images of racist white men plowing into protesting black children fill my eyes with tears and my heart with anguish every time I see it on TV. How could my people days after you say, and there wasn't even a token recognition of the hundreds of thousands marching in Washington, D.C.?
My dear, it was a purely political event concentrated on our local issue. Black people on the mainland and their struggles held no significance in our lives. The Paiwanski administration was considering of a stateside company to replace sugarcane with orange citrus trees to produce frozen concentrates. Crucian political leaders used the issue to galvanize their support with a call for Paiwanski's removal from office.
I guess I keep forgetting just how colorblind and American we had become. But as you brought to mind, 1963 was a watershed year for the civil rights movement. As it unfolded is truly beyond me. And I'm not being insensitive to our local problems. The shutting down of the whole sugarcane industry was as big an issue for us as it gets. I'm sure it was. And I'm in no way trying to minimize it. But I'm sorry, in my mind, there just couldn't be an event or issue that would cause an African descendant to miss what was happening in the States in 1963. Have you seen those images from Birmingham?
Don't forget that I actually lived through it. And I agree with you. I agree with your emotional revulsion. Looking back, it's really difficult to comprehend how this tiny insular community of African descendants simply ignored the civil rights movement. But that's as we remain in our colorless cocoon, totally oblivious to anything racial.
Now, that's a measure of the condition we call mental slavery. We just indifferently disassociate ourselves from our own kind to go about our colorless business.
And by late 1963, a significant number of Crucian accepted the leadership of our own whites, DeLugo and Lowett, was governor as an enemy they had to defend against. The Bethlehem sugar factory that opened in 1944 had become the pulse of the island, as Grove Place had been the center of activities during the height of unionism. Bethlehem had become our hub after World War II. Even the Crucian supporting the St. Thomas political party closing of the sugar factory. It was just disconcerting to think of the island without that center of activity pumping the lifeblood into every sector of the economy. Bethlehem had become so much more than a sugarcane factory, and it certainly was an effective issue to rally Crucians against Paiwanski and the St. Thomas politicians, but its citrus for sugar proposal was understood, it quickly unraveled. It turned out that the factory to process the orange would be shipped anchored offshore. The proposal was really a scheme to get frozen concentrate from South America into the American market by using the Virgin Islands' most generous tax laws.
Thank God that one didn't gain any traction. People wanting to continue working the soil in some kind of agricultural venture. As you said, when you were referring to your grandfather's fears, the die was already cast. The alumina plant had already supplanted sugarcane. Pywanski's interest didn't extend to tilling the soil. From my vantage point, he would have just as soon used our fertile lands for something other than agriculture. The less we work the land, we have to patronize his exclusive distribution.
Nonetheless, 1963 would fold into 64 with the Crucian consciousness focus on what was to happen with Bethlehem and the sugarcane industry. Of course, the civil rights movement on the mainland was building to its crest while our black majority population was otherwise preoccupied. Then the local anxiety would be compounded when the announcement came that sugar would be phased out in 2 years, meaning in 1966.
If they had only turned their consciousness north and taken in some of the upbringing flowing out of the movement. But that was not to be. Our consciousness was as insular as our lives. Understanding the relation of circumstances and upbringing to consciousness gives me the opportunity to see how our very outlook was towards the black on black conflict as we Americanized from the outside in. Wouldn't the influx of the so called aliens have dominated social exchanges as the numbers continue to balloon?
And that's exactly what was happening. The flow of foreign workers increased steadily over the decade. And as the numbers grew, looking back, I have to pause to wonder how we could have been so prejudiced against our own kind. That is, of course, unless we have some understanding of how consciousness works. So I again appeal to you to take notice of how we almost instinctively fall into our monkey see, monkey do routine. Recall that it was the federal government that declared and also obtained a sponsor. What then was to be expected of our consciousness at the very time we were embracing the concept of being Americans? Would we independently stand up against federal policies or be good, follow fashion monkeys and stand with America despising the aliens? Of course, we had already made our choice. So the only task left was to make it clear that even though we looked alike, we were most definitely not. They were aliens and we were Americans.
That's so sad. Yet, as you explained, as a people, we didn't have the upbringing to handle those circumstances any differently. The only choice would have been to be them or to be Americans. There was no middle ground, no options in our consciousness. And as you keep saying, if the information isn't there, it can't be retrieved. That is really so sad. And the power brokers, clearly seeing we didn't have an employment problem, insisted on their policy of providing more jobs so they could import more loss to comprehend what was happening to us. And as we can now see, the longer our consciousness slept through it, the worse it became, making, making it even more difficult to remedy. It is like the situation we find ourselves in now.
Think about it as you think about it yourself. Was it all a coincidence or was it just happenstance?
Now it's my chance to pull you up.
Mhm.
This is not the same person who came to see you this morning. Coincidence, like superstition, is for the uninformed. I'm not a believer in anything but knowledge. And from the knowledge I've accumulated today, I can confidently reply that our history as Crucians, with the exception of the Maroons, has been of a slavery or unincorporated territory. Our circumstances and upbringing have kept us in a subordinated posture. That emphatically tells me that Prussians have always been controlled, and the
Corollary,
corollary
corollary, yes.
is just as powerful. That consciousness has never been independently ours. So, having said that, what role could I possibly assign coincidence? Unless that happens to be somebody's name. I don't see a role for anything but deliberate trial and error.
That's a fitting description. Indeed, the deliberate, brutal trial and error continued. In this era, the face of the white man at the helm was Taiwan Sea. It was to be the tourist destination. The question remained what to do with seeing Christ. And while the question was being contemplated, the island was polarizing into two distinct classes of African descendants.
That's what I mean. America, the city on the hill we were reaching out for, was in turmoil. You make conscious of the contrast. And I've been thinking about it. Wasn't of the Civil Rights Act?
For sure, President Johnson signed it into law in early July.
I was thinking something like that. I remember reading what a big thing it was, especially with the president being a Southerner and all. Wasn't this the law to give federal authorities the enforcement power since the separate but equal doctrine was struck down? I mean, this was supposed to make the so called integration enforceable by the feds. What was wrong with us? I know I know. And it hurts to think how colorblind we had become. Our people were putting their lives on the line. Their very children were exposed to dogs, hoses, and beatings. And here we were, too busy, preoccupied with whether to call our brothers aliens or garrets. It's revolting to analyze, but that's who we were and what helped make us who and what we are today. 10 years after the US Supreme Court outlawed segregation, Black people on the mainland were battling white supremacy. And this Black American territory could have cared less. If anything, we wanted to emulate white supremacy but being colorblind. I know it's an oxymoron, but isn't that what we have become?
I know we didn't become conscious African descendants. This period actually gives us evidence that our consciousness was under part in that 2 year span between the announcement of the closing of sugar and the actual shutdown, Crucian seemed to make the adjustment. For one thing, the alumina plant had an impact this island had never seen before. Not even the beginning of the sugar cane harvest, with the arrival of migrant cane work cutters, construction construction of the plant brought many more workers than the 1,200 they said it would require. And it was a most noticeable phenomenon in the towns. Not even contract day could compare to Saturday night in West End. The construction company workers would swarm the towns like moth to naked light bulbs.
The bond, the immigration status of these imported workers was the club Crucians held over them. And for damn sure, it would only make us cling even more to that almighty Americanism we were fast adopting.
As the story goes, Governor Paiwanski didn't have to go looking for an oil refinery. Line, Leon Hess got an appointment, walked into the governor's office, and made him an offer he couldn't refuse. It was an ironclad proposal for the island looking for purpose.
Cocoa Bay on top of yours, for true. And just like that, did we end up with one of the world's largest refineries on our south shore? Am I also to understand?
Struck again, President Johnson's prodigious, prodigious anti-poverty drive came just as lucky came just as the lucky governor was making room for all the Crucian being displaced with the shutdown of Bethlehem.
I thought as much when you spoke about the politicians in grants. So that gave them yet another mechanism for dividing African descendants.
Absolutely, but we'll get to that just now. Let's try to fit the oil refinery in its context. Call it luck, if you will, but I'm too cynical to not suspect an unseen hand. As I try to portray the closing down of Bethlehem Sugar Factory represented a seismic shift in the Crucian way of being had been our meal ticket for as long as anybody could remember. And then suddenly every single thing involved in and related to the production of sugar was to cease. Bethlehem, since the war, had become the single source of grinding cane for sugar. Without the grinding heart of the industry, there was no industry.
Oh my God, says, what was to happen to all those hundreds and hundreds of acres the Senker Labor Union had under sugarcane cultivation and all its members who would have been living on those estates?
You're grasping the magnitude of our social dislocation as this island took on the year 1966. It's a year that still resonates in the Crucian consciousness.
I can't wait to hear all Series 66 stuff. It's something I never really understood. Although with what you've already explained, I think I have a better perspective.
Let me try to set the stage. Leo Harvey and Leon Hess seemed to have been two very different personalities, and I'm basing this on the way their proposals were first introduced, were ratified. The much larger oil refinery deal dispersed considerably less opposition and controversy than the alumina plant. Granted that the change social condition would certainly have played a part, but those changes would have more likely been an influence on how the deal was influenced the presentation. I don't know. But it was a remarkable difference the way the two deals were presented and within a short period of time. The purchase of the land contract the, to construct the refinery from a local family didn't hurt Mr. Head's public image, especially when the family would subsequently announce the construction of the island's first shopping center.
You're talking about Sunny Isles and the Disha Bird family, not so? That built our shopping center.
The news put the oil refinery in a favorable light when compared to the alumina plant, and that opposition was centered around the loss of the Cross Lagoon. In many ways, it represented the very womb of fish and marine life on the south shore of the island. But I guess we reasoned that since we had already increased such a big thing and the island wasn't being used anyhow, sorry, and the land wasn't being used anyhow, so why not sell it and make it productive?
One question. Was the land Mr. Disha Bird had accused David Hamilton Jackson of fingering a part of this deal?
You're sharp as ever. Blessing were at the heart of the transaction. And I must confess, it's one of the most iconic circumstances I've ever come across.
This I've got to hear. What is the irony?
Back in 1920, when Mr. Dishabert started accusing Mr. Jackson, remember? It was about the same time, it was about the same estate and how he had supposedly improperly acquired them.
I remember the details well. The estates never belonged to the union. Didn't Mr. Casper Holson buy those estates?
Exactly. And how could Mr. Dishabert not have known that? He was right there as all the arrangements were made to use the dairy farm as the first headquarters. It's very difficult to understand how he could have been an integral part of the time Caspar Holstein bought the estate and literally turned over to his brother-in-law and the union, yet not have known the facts. And it was a major issue with the man as he charged Mr. Jackson with mismanagement and corruption.
But you said that when Mr. Holstein went to jail in Joseph Alec, didn't David Hamilton Jackson say anything?
I can't say, but as I've tried to point out, Mr. Jackson wasn't much for public disputes with his membership. He tended to save his verbal weapons for the planters and the government. Although he had some memorable exchanges with Morris, by the time Mr. Dishabert acquired the estate, it was pretty much just some more water under the bridge. The time for any relevance, if he would have needed any, had long since passed.
So, what part of the oil refinery is on those estates then?
That's the irony. Estate Hope was the site of the sits almost in the identical location of the first Union headquarters. How about that irony?
The story of this island of ours is so compelling. So many twists and turns and such irony. It's a drama that needs to be told. What a development! Thank God David Hamilton Jackson had passed away. Truly wrenching experience to live to witness. I would imagine even Mr. Deshabert would have had second thoughts if he were alive. Talk about irony. It's outright down pressing. I'm deflated just taking it in as a just awakened observer. Unbelievable. But like so many other unbelievable things I've had to digest today, it's like this stuff is kept under lock and key. I've driven headquarters building any number of times. How will I perceive it the next time I drive by? Maybe I'll have a surreal episode and picture the whole place as a dairy with a union headquarters. Wishful thinking. I'm just absolutely appalled at the misleadership of our good for nothing misleaders. How could something like this not be of importance to Crucian students? I bet you it's a call as that about the damn refinery I smell every day.
So how come you didn't go to college?
I would have. I had offers, scholarships, financial assistance, the whole works. But I fell in love with a black stud who had more children than I'm still able to count. I did end up taking some courses at UVI, but I couldn't until today. I had attributed it to motherhood. But now I'm thinking I just wasn't stimulated. Neither the professors or the material engaged me. As I'm sure you can tell, I need to be challenged intellectually like you're doing with this telling of my island story that made me think I had been living somewhere else. Do you think I could have ever imagined that the behemoth headquarters of David Hamilton Jackson's first headquarters? Just the thought fouls the nest of my consciousness. It's obscene. It's blasphemous. At the very least, a decent historical plaque should have been erected to mark the location of the first headquarters of organized labor in the Caribbean.
I'm as sorry about your relationship as I can be. I'm sincerely sorry. But once again, I must point out that our consciousness comes from only two sources. And if neither of those two sources of our information is exposed to what we need to know at any given moment, we're at a distinct disadvantage. Decision on those multi-billion dollars deal. All humility leaves them as they act like they know what they're doing. But no sooner than they open their mouths to expound on their position, we know they don't understand. And as with the alumina plant, only later would of their lack of misunderstanding be apparent to all. With S oil sitting next to Harvey Alumina, these 84 square miles were transformed in ways we're still trying to comprehend.
So it would be the governor's good fortune that as the sugarcane industry ceased operations, St. Croix had two industrial plants to replace it.
Too. But it definitely wasn't a coincidence that created the peculiar division of labor that resulted. I remind you that this is the period of time when federal dollars were flowing like a revenue source as the anti-poverty program funded the expansion of the local government. This growth of our government or the two-tier employment system that developed public works, experienced growth like it never had before. It quickly outgrew its locations in both towns as it took to as it took in the displaced form as it took in the displaced from the sugarcane industry. And this would of course include the workers and union estates we've wandered about. The new industrial plan of many of the sugar factory workers, especially the machinists from Bethlehem. But the one thing that became crystal clear was that while Crucians had their choice of employment, the immigrants were shut out of government jobs. They remained the underclass bonded workers in need of a sponsor who would then have virtually absolute power over them. Government jobs were in those times, but only for Crucians.
And yet nobody saw this future coming.
Really. Oh, that's me. I can't say. I never heard or read anything to that effect. But politicians saw the opportunity the polarization afforded them. Government spending had grown 500% since Pywanski took office.
So that's where the jobs for vote came from. The Earl Otley people were presented with the perfect opportunity to build their ranks. And by excluding immigrants who couldn't vote, they gave themselves manageable numbers they could literally count on election day.
Once again, your assessment is right on point. The Senate president, who was a leader of the Senate, was also the island's effective union leader. Earl Otley was not conscious of his African descent. Of his African descent. He was a workaholic with an almost pathological devotion to the details of organizing. On the other hand, the Crucian political party was led by a white man who relocated to St. Croix from St. Thomas as a radio was his ability to speak like a local while making fun of himself on the air. Ron DeLugo was no match for Earl Atlee, but he was white.
Now you've lost me. I was under the impression Ronda Lugo and the Centomians were on the same side. Isn't this the same Ronda Lugo who was our delegate in Washington?
One and the same, but he didn't start out on the same side with Atlee and the Unity Party. He got his start in politics after moving to St. Croix as the Mango Jones character on the radio. It was the popularity of his character on St. Croix radio that catapulted him to the leadership with the Democrats.
That doesn't speak well of our political maturity at the time. And please don't think I'm implying we're doing so much better now. But I this island today. And however popular they may appear to be on the radios, use it as a springboard to a successful political career. I'm confident we've passed the stage.
Unfortunately, that was not the case in the 60s. As people, as a people, we were susceptible to white leadership. We wasn't just gullible to the antics of Mango Jones. Almost any white individual could get us to accept their leadership as opposed to one of our own. Check it out. You might be surprised to learn how many we had in our not so remote past. And I'll submit this to be one of the reasons our political leadership was dominated by St. Thomas. While both islands entertained white politicians pretty much throughout the 20th century, St. Thomians were able to use the post war period to produce their own credible leadership under Earl Attlee. Until Ralph Pywanski, Attlee had bowed to no man and created his own homegrown political base with the St. Thomas Labour Union, the Unity Political Party, and the Home Journal newspaper.
You've got him. You've got him seeming to be the St. Thomas David Hamilton Jackson. Am I wrong in suggesting that?
There's certainly some similarity to be found here, but I would have to point out that political power was Attlee's objective. I couldn't say that about Mr. Jackson. Yet I that both men shared an exceptional ability to organize people. I guess the big difference would have been how those organizing skills were used. Attlee broke no opposition to his political leadership other than Pywanski, the one man he yielded to, and the political machine controlled by those two men kept Crucian politicians playing catch up throughout the 60s.
I would have thought that a man like Brother Hodge could go up against Atlee, but unless I'm hearing you right, none of our politicians could equal him.
That's that's not quite what I'm saying. As I explained earlier, Brother Hodge was the independent who many times outmaneuvered both the St. Thomas and St. Croix factions. I am not so much talking about intellectual prowess as I'm about organizational skills and the discipline, the diligence it requires to get the job done. We had no match for Attlee's passionate dedication to the minutiae of organizing people. So when you compare this organized persona with that of the fun-loving, hard-drinking Ron DeLugo, it's relatively easy to understand how we were dominated by the St. Thomas politicians.
When you said the big Crucian rally and protest against Pywanski was led by Ron De Lugo and Fritz Lawetz, I wondered about that. I didn't understand why our politicians would join their struggle against a white man. It was confusing. Only now am I beginning to make sense of that bizarre domination.
The bottom line is that Attlee's labor union leadership and political skills at St. Thomas as tightly organized as a drum, while St. Croix was a loose network of minor personalities and community activists taking marching orders from a radio personality having the time of his life, riding a wave of popularity from
Well, no wonder at least people could set up over here and make such inroads.
exactly, and making matters worse, in a colorblind society, the Prussians who challenged the status quo by taking up the banner of the St. Thomas Unity Party were well known popular African descendants who directed their campaign at the grassroots. They characterized their Deluga faction as stuck up elites who were hopelessly and with their organizing categories imported from St. Thomas, the Democratic Party establishment had a fight on its hands. Key politically sensitive positions in government, such as in the administration of public works, where hundreds were being hired, were staffed with the Unity's best operatives on the island. Jobs for votes was as effective on St. Croix as it had been on St. Thomas.
And poor us over here, trying to follow a novice to nowhere. If Mango Joe was reality, where did the midnight shepherd come in?
Oh, you heard about that? That man was always in some confusion or the other. One night after wrecking yet another automobile, he explained that he had been trying to avoid hitting a sheep crossing the road. And as Crucians, being agrarian in the 60s, became his start from street corners and rum shop to the Calypsonians.
With, with that kind of leadership, we didn't stand much of a chance against the St. Thomas political machine. As sugar was coming to an end and the local government was expanding with federal money, the Unity Party took control of who would get the jobs. And you already said that to lead Otley and the Unity Party. That could only mean that everything from the Department of Labor to the legislature would have been moving parts of the well oiled St. Thomas political machine. Even with my hindsight, I don't see how the outcome could have been predicted.
It was a pivotal year for us. The island was flooded with Caribbean workers we called aliens. Harvey and never before. When VI Corp shut down Bethlehem and the sugar industry after the NAM 66 harvest, it was a whimper compared to the unrest the announcement generated. The people's attention had become focused on the political upheaval that had been sprouting and was now ripe for harvesting.
Victory 66, right? And don't tell me I'm rushing. This time I'm not guessing. I'm on top of it now.
And you're right, this would be the election campaign of 1966. It changed the political landscape of the Virgin Islands and gave us the legislative apportionment we have today.
I've been waiting for this. Let me make sure I've got it right. St. Croix and St. John were with the Democratic Party, which has the national affiliation tightly controlled by the homegrown Unity Party, led by the Senate President and Labor leader, Otley. So far, so good. And since the governor wouldn't leave his nationality affiliated party to join the homegrown party, the Otley led sycophants were left with the option of the Republican or Democratic Party. That campaign was to consolidate power after taking over the name as Motor and Pestle.
Great, very good. I just wish you had started at the 1954 Revised Organic Act. As you recall, that was the root of the problem with power hungry politicians.
I remember you made it clear that the Centomians in particular were upset about the apportionment of the legislature between the district and at large senators. You said they didn't understand the Republican form of government, the Republican Party. You talked about them not appreciating the check and balance in the body.
That was certainly how I read the historical facts. The problem appeared when the politicians became aware of the check and balances between the district and at large senators. Four at large senators to be elected by all three islands, but only the top two, seven district senators, would be representing three separate districts, three of each from St. Christ and St. Thomas, and one from St. John. As the first four elections under the 54 Act demonstrated, it was a daunting challenge to dominate such a check and balance lawmaking institution.
And you're saying that's exactly the reason why they oppose the new system. I suppose that being accustomed to dominating the municipal council, they expected to continue their control. So when they checked out the new system, it struck them as a hindrance, blocking their progress. But the 1962 election gave them the two winners from St. Croix. Why didn't that satisfy them?
That they would have known what it took them to come out victorious.
Meaning,
That the two winning at large candidates on St. Thomas, Attlee and Maduro, had to give the right number of votes to James and Williams and St. Croix for them to emerge the winners.
whoa, hold up with me a minute. Votes to the St. Croix candidates? How did that work?
It was a great example of the meticulous organizing skills of Attlee. The man was able to make Lugo truly into Mango Jones. He used the voters' list as his blueprint, and because it was or by way of his labor union, Ackley was able to comb the names until he had a solid number of reliable electors to plan his car for.
And was this all legal stuff?
Absolutely. Lists are public doing anything Randy Lugo couldn't do if he had the capability. Everything was on the up and up. The man just did his homework and then some. He was able to accurately estimate the number of votes it would take for the four at large candidates to win.
Yeah, that might have taken some doing, but it doesn't explain how he was able to share out the right number of votes to those four winners.
Those reliable supporters that would vote exactly the way he instructed them to. On election day, he and his lieutenants covered every polling place with their list of reliable voters. Their mission was to keep their special voters from casting their ballots exact early. The electoral universe of St. Thomas being sufficiently limited for them to manage their numbers with the greatest efficiency. By the of election day, Attlee would have been able to make his calculations. He would then know how he needed his reliable voters to vote. But as it turned out, in 1962, the St. Thomas Unity machine had rallied their troops and really turned out the vote. So that late fateful afternoon, all political operatives at the St. Thomas polling place were frantically to stop voting for Attlee and Maduro, to call all votes for James and Williams.
Hmm. Wow, I see what you mean by oddly being organized. I can only wish he was a conscious black man, or at least as black oriented as David Hamilton Jackson, because he wouldn't have allowed for all that alien black on black enmity for sure. But oddly seemed to possess the same kind of org had to have been amazing back in 1962. Though for him to so accurately calculate those numbers and then execute the plan, that had to have been political history.
Don't close the books too soon. There was still the 64 election before the one in 66. We're trying to get to. And we don't want to forget what I understand as the item the fifth legislature took up under the presidency of Attlee.
Yes, I remember. You said they immediately set to work on a new election code. It's all making so much sense now. They had to adjust the laws to their purpose, which clearly was the takeover of the Democratic Party. You got, sorry.
You got that right. The reapportionment or reconstructing of the legislative affiliation. The strategy unfolded with a new election law, placing all political parties in the public domain. Primary elections would henceforth determine the party officers and party candidates.
And why not? Athlete's Party had already demonstrated its superior organizing abilities. Hadn't they just snatched the seats from the Crucians in a wide open head to head competition? I would put my money on the Centomians every time. You've explained how loosely organized the Crucian political players were, and they were led by a less than disciplined and organized white man who obviously couldn't walk in Otley's shoes. What chance did we have once the Centomians made up their minds to take us over? So I don't find it at all surprising that the St. Thomas Unity Party advances against the St. Croix Democrats in an open primary election to determine control of the party.
Unfortunately for us Crucian, the leadership of Randy Lugo and Fritz Lowet couldn't see what you so clearly observe as our disadvantage. A case in point being the political aspirations of our large Puerto Rican population. Being enfranchised by the 54 Act, they hadn't been shy about their ambitions for political power. Yet, it would be the St. Thomas base fraction that would step forward to make room for the Puerto Ricans. We can only imagine the closed door negotiation that must have taken place to separate the successful at large duo of Dr. Randall James and Patrick Williams. It was accomplished with the growing number of Puerto Rican voters serving as the incentive. At large Senator Patrick Williams was replaced with the popular Latino candidate Ariel Diaz.
What a travesty. Our politicians actually allowed the St. Thomas based Unity Party to make a puppy show out of us when they allowed them to capture the primary was going to determine their future. It just seems like they should have been pulling out all stops in anticipation of the vote.
Maybe it wasn't such a political imperative to the likes of a leader like Randy Logo, but I can assure you that the approach of the primary election was producing nail-biting and Democratic partisans on the island. The print media remained as before pro-democratic, and the radio station anchored by Mango Jones was fiercely behind the Crucian Democrats. The Unity Party confronted the constant barrage against them with boots on the ground. Neither our media or our political leaders seemed to take notice of how effective the opposition was. Ever since Attlee's faction took over the legislature, Randy Lugo's leadership became one of reaction. He uses professional vocal cords to protest and vilify the actions of the Unity Party. His actions were limited to walking out on sessions or staying away from them as if those gestures would prevent the opposition from carrying out its plans. Even in registering new voters for the historic elections, the conservative Democrats lagged behind on the streets. It was getting more tense with every passing day, his heart wanting to remain faithful to the insular politics that was all he knew. But his head had little difficulty discerning the down to earth, boots on the ground efficiency of the Unity Party.
Hindsight makes it so axiomatic.
Really.
If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Air of condescension in the Mango Jones character. He seemed to do more grandstanding than anything else. All I'm getting from him is talk, talk, talk. Where are the instances of Mango Jones rolling up his sleeves and doing some serious work like Atlee? As you said, he was having the time of his life. His passion would not have been of the same conviction as his followers, unless this was a white man intoxicated with a hero worship our black people were clothing him in. If Atlee had been a conscious African descendant, he would have felt insulted to have to consider that white man a worthy opponent.
I would be the first to admit, as I've already done, that political leadership on this island wasn't anything to be proud of. The white men at the top were so worshipped by blacks. They needed only utter the marching orders and everybody would fall in line. This was produced. Brother Hajj was an independent and a loner without a political party until he blatantly ran unsuccessful with the Mortar and Pestle Democrats. The only viable political organization we ever had here was the Democratic Party, and it was agrarian, conservative, and comfortably in charge until confronted by the homegrown political machine fashioned in St.
Only one, but how close was it?
Not close at all. Of the 22 seats on the territorial committee of the Democratic Party, the St. Thomians won 16 of them. The Crucian faction won 2 seats on St. John, but only 4 on St. Croix. So that was the end of that.
And just like that, the Democratic Party of the Virgin Islands was lost to the St. Thomas faction that up until then was the Unity Party. What radical coup they pulled on the Crucian establishment. I know the Centomians and their Crucian counterparts must have been giddy with celebration. But what of the Crucian former Democrats? How did they react? They just didn't start to bawl and curl up like gongolos, did they?
Oh, let me tell you, there was bawling for days on end. But the leadership finally got active and went to the federal court. And did they ever go crazy with jubilation when the court ruled in their favor and granted an injunction staying the results of the primary election?
Wow, that was some serious drama. I never knew there was so much controversy going on in 1964. All I could tell you about that year was the Voting Rights Act and Vietnam. And I'm dead serious. I can't believe the critical history I've been missing. By the time I came around, people were ashamed of it and buried it. But that would still only be an excuse. Like history is supposed to be mine to know, not in someone else's power to decide if I should know. So anyhow, the Prussian former Democrats fought back and reclaimed their title. How did they manage in the November elections?
I can assure you the Senate president didn't start to go out and get pissing drunk.
Wait, don't tell me. Did he? I bet he won the appeal.
Yes, he did. And he went on to win the November elections with the Puerto Ricans' vote.
Talk about drama. That coup was much more intriguing than I thought. The Democratic old guard didn't go so easy after all. Like a chicken, when you wring its neck, it had
Choose to characterize it. That was the state of the Prussian body politic that would devise the ad called Victory 66.
okay. And it
Hmm?
not yet? Okay, we'll just run it. Oh, I get it now. I really didn't have a context for Victory 66 before, and I could never whole thing. But now I'm understanding that having lost control of their party, Democrats were like a soldier crab without its shell. It had to quickly find a few cover to navigate through life. Victory 66 was nothing more than the new shell Fusions had to adapt to.
I don't know if it could compare with a soldier crab needing a new shell, but for sure, the Crucian Democrats had lost their political party. Behind their bearings for the 66 election, the US Congress finally yielded to the lobbying efforts of the Centonians. The legislature of the Virgin Islands would be increased from 11 to 15 members, and the body would have the power of apportionment. Sorry.
Was this to be the new system after the election, or did it have an immediate effect?
The proclamation for a 15-member legislature, and that body would have the authority to reapportion itself. Yes, so yes, it was a crucial election with the Crucian faction in complete dismay.
Lord, if it wasn't for bad luck, recrusions wouldn't have any luck at all. It's like we couldn't catch a break.
This one or this one? No, stand it.
Okay, well,
I'm
this one.
yeah. There you go. No, that's a characterization I can work with. No, that's a characterization I could work with. Because while we are depending on luck and catching a break, Atlee consistently had his people doing their homework and being prepared for the task at hand. The latest of a list of last minute jerry built initiative coming from an intellectually bankrupt leadership of Mango Jones. Having lost the right to be a political party meant the Crucians no longer had the right to use a symbol in their electioneering activities. It may seem a trivial thing to the uninitiated in local politics, but the symbol like the donkey and were essential to our political campaigns. It may have been a relic attributed to illiteracy when we would vote by marking an X next to the symbol of our choice. So a fraction without a legally recognized symbol was at a disadvantage. The logo's idea was to merge with the Republican Party so that the elephant could be used as the symbol. That idea was by the frank, by the rank and file with the extreme prejudice. Victory 66 turned out to be the most agreeable vehicle the former Democrat could come up with. An eagle was the symbol they settled on for what resulted in a loose coalition between former Democrats, Republicans, and anyone else they could enlist in their lot in Alaska.
Was it that hopeless a situation? I was always under the impression that Crucians were wary of the Centomian politicians and were much more inclined to stand independently of our smaller but better politically connected sister island.
And I would be willing to agree with you. However, as I've been trying to explain, the Crucian political leadership was the inept hand on the steering wheel of any vehicle we might have fashioned. So you'd be willing to agree. We needed a David Hamilton Jackson, not a Mambo Jones.
All right, so we end our reading on page 254 and
250, yeah, 50, 54.
254.
And we'll start at 255.
Correct, next time.
So put that here next time.
Yes, indeed. So, can you pass the drink over?
Yes.
So get ready to set our timer to half an hour so that we could take that time to reason about what we read. And let me just start in saying thank you, Mario C Moorhead, for the work that you have done. And wow, thank you, that's Malachi, for sharing in the reading tonight. We that was a marathon. Oh my gosh. So
Yeah.
I kind of highlighted some caught my attention, and well, I'll start with the most recent one, and then I'll go back. But the most recent discussion was about the popularity and how Randy Lugo used used his radio um, waves, so to speak, to